The ceasefire was signed on July 27, 1953. No peace treaty followed. The guns stopped. The armies did not leave. The command structures did not stand down. The alert postures did not reset. And 70 years later, more than 1 million soldiers still face each other across a 4-kilometer strip of land in one of the most heavily militarized corridors on Earth. The Korean Peninsula is not a frozen conflict. It is an active system, one that has never stopped generating pressure, never stopped requiring decisions, and never stopped carrying the risk of catastrophic escalation. From a single miscalculation, the war system never ended. It was suspended, and suspension has a cost. This is the command structure. Let's break it down. The Korean Armistice Agreement of 1953 was a military ceasefire, not a peace treaty, not a political settlement, not a resolution of the underlying claims. It suspended active combat. It established the military demarcation line, the boundary that became the DMZ. It created a framework for prisoner exchange, and it set up the Military Armistice Commission to manage violations and incidents. What it did not do: it did not establish diplomatic relations between North and South Korea. It did not resolve the question of which government had legitimate authority over the peninsula. It did not dismantle either side's military structure. It did not create the conditions for a lasting political settlement. A ceasefire without a peace treaty is not an ending. It is a pause with an armed return option permanently on the table. The Korean War began in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. The intervention of U.S. and United Nations forces pushed the North Koreans back. Chinese intervention in late 1950 reversed the momentum again. 3 years of fighting produced a front line that was not far from where the conflict began. The human cost was enormous. Estimates suggest several million military and civilian dead across the peninsula. The physical infrastructure of Korea was largely destroyed. And at the end of it, the political situation was structurally similar to where it started. This outcome shaped everything that followed. Neither side accepted the armistice line as a permanent, legitimate border. Both sides maintained the armed posture of a state that expected the conflict to resume. And both sides built military systems specifically designed to prevail if it did. The demilitarized zone is approximately 250 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide. It is one of the most surveilled stretches of land in the world. Despite its name, it is not demilitarized. It is heavily fortified on both sides. Guard posts, observation positions, minefields, sensor arrays, fencing, and alert forces positioned for immediate response. The DMZ serves a specific function in the war system. It is a buffer that slows the initial tempo of any attack. It provides time, measured in minutes and hours, not days, for command systems to recognize what is happening and begin to respond. The DMZ does not prevent war. It compresses the warning time before war begins. That distinction matters enormously. The geography behind the DMZ is the core of the strategic problem. Seoul, the South Korean capital and home to roughly half the country's economic output, is approximately 60 kilometers from the DMZ. North Korean artillery and rocket systems positioned near the border can reach Seoul without aircraft, without missiles, and without crossing the DMZ. They can do it with guns. This means that the opening phase of any major conflict on the peninsula begins with Seoul under fire, and the response to that fire must happen fast enough to prevent the initial salvos from becoming the defining fact of the battle. The system is designed around this constraint, but the constraint has never been removed. It has only been managed. North Korea's Korean People's Army is one of the largest standing militaries in the world by personnel count. Available assessments suggest approximately 1.2 million active duty soldiers, with reserve and paramilitary forces substantially larger. The KPA's command structure flows directly from the Supreme Leader, currently Kim Jong-un, through the Ministry of National Defense and the General Staff Department. Military decisions at the strategic level are not made through institutional deliberation. They are made by or with the direct authority of the Supreme Leader. This concentration of command authority has specific operational characteristics. It means that major military decisions can be made quickly when the leadership chooses to move. It also means that the system is dependent on the functioning of a small number of decision nodes. And it means that field commanders have limited authority to act independently. in ways that depart from centrally issued plans. A centralized command structure can generate speed at the strategic level and rigidity at the tactical level simultaneously. Both matter in the first hours of a conflict. The KPA's conventional forces are organized around large ground formations: infantry corps, mechanized corps, and artillery corps. The artillery and rocket forces are the most strategically significant element for any scenario involving Seoul. Long-range artillery systems and multiple rocket launchers, positioned within range of the South Korean capital, represent the primary instrument of immediate coercive pressure. North Korea has also developed a substantial strategic strike capability through its ballistic missile and nuclear programs. The specific inventory and readiness state of these forces is not publicly verifiable in precise detail, but the existence of a nuclear capability, combined with a delivery system that can reach the continental United States, has transformed the strategic context of the peninsula completely. One of the least discussed but most operationally significant elements of North Korea's military is its Special Operations Force, estimated at approximately 200,000 personnel, making it one of the largest such forces in the world. These forces are organized for infiltration operations, insertion behind South Korean lines by submarine, tunnel, hovercraft, and aircraft, to attack command posts, airfields, logistics hubs, radar installations, and the political leadership in Seoul. The operational logic is disruption, not defeating the South Korean army in conventional battle, fragmenting its command structure and logistics system in the opening hours, before the conventional battle is fully joined. The first battle of a new Korean war is not the DMZ crossing. It is the simultaneous disruption of every node that makes coordinated defense possible. The Republic of Korea Armed Forces fields approximately 550,000 active duty personnel, with a mobilizable reserve force of several million. It is one of the most capable and well-equipped military forces in Asia, with modern armor, advanced air defense systems, a capable air force, and an indigenous defense industry that has produced competitive weapons platforms. The ROK Armed Forces operate within the framework of the Combined Forces Command, a bilateral U.S.-South Korean command structure established in 1978. The CFC maintains operational control of both ROK and U.S. forces in wartime, under a commander who is a U.S. four-star general. The combined command structure is the institutional expression of the alliance. It means that South Korean and American forces train together, plan together, and have integrated command procedures, designed to function from the opening moments of a conflict. The combined character of the command matters for a specific reason. In the first hours of a conflict on the peninsula, the most important question is not whether forces are available. It is whether those forces can operate as one coordinated system, rather than as two parallel military structures that happen to be near each other. Integration is not a state of being. It is a continuous achievement of training, communication, and shared planning that must be maintained or it degrades. U.S. Forces Korea maintains approximately 28,500 personnel on the peninsula, with headquarters at Camp Humphreys south of Seoul. These forces include air combat units at Osan and Kunsan air bases, ground forces, intelligence assets, and command and control infrastructure. The presence of U.S. forces in Korea serves a function that is primarily deterrent. Their role in the event of conflict would be to anchor the U.S. commitment, to provide specific capabilities, particularly air power and ISR, that amplify ROK effectiveness, and to signal to North Korea that any attack on South Korea is an attack on the United States. The reinforcement architecture matters as much as the forward presence. U.S. war plans for the peninsula involve substantial reinforcement from the United States and Japan. In the event of conflict, prepositioned equipment and theater, designated air and sea lines of communication, and established logistics hubs are designed to support this reinforcement. The reinforcement timeline is a critical variable. U.S. forces cannot be fully deployed to Korea in days. The initial battle, the first week or two of a conflict, would be fought primarily by ROK forces with U.S. air support, and the forces already in theater. Forward presence buys time. It does not buy victory. The difference between the two is the reinforcement pipeline, and the reinforcement pipeline takes weeks. The concentration of North Korean long-range artillery near the DMZ is not a new development. It has been the defining conventional military fact of the peninsula for decades. Systems including the 170mm Koks-and self-propelled gun, 240mm and 300mm multiple rocket launchers, and various shorter-range artillery pieces are positioned in hardened firing positions along the northern side of the DMZ. Many of these positions are in tunnels or underground facilities that reduce their vulnerability to airstrike. The operational logic of this force is to be able to begin a devastating barrage on Seoul within minutes of an order being given, before South Korean or U.S. forces have had time to destroy the launchers. Counter-battery fire, targeting the artillery systems as soon as they fire, is the primary military response available to ROK and U.S. forces. The effectiveness of counter-battery operations depends on the speed with which radar can locate incoming rounds and compute their origin, the availability of counter-battery weapons in range, and the time required to destroy hardened tunnel-based positions. Even a highly effective counter-battery campaign would take time, and in that time, shells and rockets would be landing in Seoul. The artillery problem cannot be solved before the conflict begins. It can only be managed after it starts. This asymmetry is structural. It has been built into the system for 70 years. North Korea's first nuclear test was in 2006. Since then, it has conducted 5 additional tests and developed ballistic missiles capable of reaching Guam, Japan, and the continental United States. The acquisition of a nuclear capability has transformed the strategic situation on the peninsula in ways that cannot be overstated. Before nuclear weapons, the strategic question was, could North Korea successfully invade South Korea? Could the United States and South Korea successfully defeat a North Korean invasion? After nuclear weapons, the question becomes, at what point in a conventional conflict does the leadership in Pyongyang assess that using nuclear weapons would better serve its survival interests than continuing to absorb losses? This question cannot be answered from the outside with certainty. It depends on decisions that will be made by a small number of people, under conditions of extreme pressure, in a command structure that does not deliberate in the way that institutional democracies do. The nuclear dimension does not make war more likely. It makes the decision to go to war more complex for every actor, and it makes the consequences of miscalculation categorically different. The U.S. extended deterrence commitment to South Korea and Japan. The commitment to use U.S. nuclear weapons if necessary to defend its allies is the institutional response to this problem. But extended deterrence is a communication. Its effectiveness depends on its credibility. And credibility is not a permanent condition. It requires continuous maintenance, below the threshold of kinetic conflict. The Korean Peninsula has been the site of a continuous cyber and electronic warfare competition for at least 2 decades. North Korea has developed a significant cyber capability, estimated to include thousands of trained operators, engaged in operations ranging from intelligence collection to financial theft used to fund the weapons programs, to destructive attacks on South Korean infrastructure. The 2014 Sony Pictures hack, attributed to North Korea by U.S. government agencies, demonstrated willingness to conduct destructive cyber operations for political purposes. Multiple incidents of attacks on South Korean financial institutions, media organizations, and government systems have been attributed to North Korean actors. In a pre-conflict context, cyber operations serve the same function as the artillery positioning. They are instruments of pressure that impose costs on the adversary without crossing the threshold that would require a military response. A conflict on the Korean Peninsula would not begin only with artillery fire. It would begin with the simultaneous activation of every instrument of pressure that has been prepositioned, including those that have been operating invisibly for years. Military planners on both sides of the DMZ spend significant institutional effort on the question of strategic warning. How much notice would the alliance have before a North Korean attack? The answer depends on what kind of attack is being considered. A long-planned conventional invasion, moving large mechanized formations south, would likely generate detectable mobilization indicators. Weeks or days before the attack, intelligence would detect the movement of units from garrison, the positioning of fuel and ammunition, the activation of command facilities, A more limited but still devastating action. A sudden artillery barrage on Seoul. A missile strike on specific targets. A special forces insertion operation might generate far less strategic warning. The forces required could be prepositioned. The decision could be made and executed quickly. This distinction matters because the alliance's response options are heavily dependent on warning time. With days of warning, forces can be readied. Civilians can be moved to shelter. Command systems can be elevated to wartime posture. With minutes of warning, the response is whatever is already in position and already alert. The military capability you have when the first round falls is the military capability that matters. Everything else requires time you may not have. The operational concept behind a North Korean opening strike, as understood from publicly available military analysis, is simultaneity and speed, not a sequential escalation, not a limited probe to test the response. A simultaneous activation of every available instrument, designed to overwhelm the defender's ability to prioritize and respond. Artillery fire on military targets in Seoul. Ballistic missile strikes on airbases, command posts, and logistics nodes. Special forces insertions behind the main line. Cyber operations targeting command and control networks. Electronic warfare disrupting radar and communications. Each of these individually is manageable. Simultaneously, they place an extraordinary demand on the command system to classify, prioritize, and direct responses to multiple simultaneous threat categories at once. The goal of the opening phase is not to destroy the defense. It is to overload it. A command system that cannot process simultaneous multi-domain pressure fast enough begins to fail, not from destruction, but from saturation. This is the same logic as the drone saturation scenario. It is not unique to Korea. It is the logic of modern military pressure applied to a specific geography. The ROK-US Combined Forces Command activates its wartime procedures in response to the opening exchange. This activation involves transitioning command authority from peacetime to wartime arrangements, notifying allied governments and requesting reinforcement, authorizing ROK and U.S. Air Forces to conduct strike operations, and beginning counter-battery operations against North Korean artillery. Each of these steps requires decision authority to flow through a command chain that is simultaneously under physical attack and electronic warfare interference. The hardening of the Combined Forces Command's facilities, the redundancy built into its communications, and the training investment in operating under degraded conditions are specifically designed to preserve command function in the opening hours. But hardening reduces vulnerability. It does not eliminate it. And the opening phase is designed specifically to test where the hardening is insufficient. Command resilience is not binary. It degrades. The question is whether it degrades faster than the defense can compensate and faster than reinforcement can arrive. Air power is the most significant asymmetric capability that the alliance holds. In a Korean conflict scenario, the ROK Air Force and U.S. air assets in theater hold a substantial qualitative advantage over North Korean air forces in aircraft performance, pilot training, and weapons systems. In the early hours of a conflict, air forces on both sides would be competing for the ability to operate in contested airspace. North Korea's integrated air defense system, while older than modern NATO comparable systems, is dense and layered, with surface-to-air missile coverage over most of its territory. Alliance air operations would need to simultaneously conduct counter-battery support for ground forces, suppress North Korean air defense systems, strike missile launchers and command nodes, and provide close air support as required. The demand on alliance air assets in the first 24 to 72 hours would likely exceed the available capacity in theater. The reinforcement of air assets from Japan, Guam, and the continental United States would be the critical variable that shapes the air battle beyond the first days. The alliance's air superiority is real but not instantaneous. The first hours are fought by the forces already in theater. Everything else is a function of time and the logistics pipeline. The most analytically critical and most uncertain dimension of a Korean conflict scenario is not the conventional military balance. It is the escalation management problem. As conventional losses mount on the North Korean side, As the alliance's air power begins to degrade North Korean military capabilities systematically, the pressure on the North Korean leadership to consider nuclear options increases. This is not because nuclear use is the expected or likely response. It is because the decision environment in which that choice would be made is one of extreme pressure, incomplete information, and a leadership structure that is explicitly built around the survival of the regime. Alliance planning accounts for this risk. The combination of military pressure and diplomatic channels, and the maintenance of off-ramps that allow the North Korean leadership to stop short of nuclear use, are as much a part of the operational planning as the counter-battery fire and the air sorties. A military plan that does not account for escalation management is not a complete plan. On the Korean Peninsula, where the escalation ladder reaches the nuclear level within the same peninsula, this is not a theoretical concern. The most important analytical question about the Korean security situation is not tactical. It is structural. Why has the war system persisted for 70 years? Why has a military ceasefire not been converted into a political settlement? The answer lies in the interests of the parties, the structure of the North Korean political system, the role of external powers, and the specific incentives that the current situation creates. For North Korea, the unresolved conflict is a political resource. The permanent state of threat justifies the military-first prioritization of the economy. It justifies the internal surveillance and control system. It justifies the nuclear program as the ultimate guarantor of regime survival. A genuine peace treaty that normalized relations with South Korea would remove the external threat that the North Korean system uses to explain and justify its own character. The war system persists in part because it serves the interests of the system that benefits most from its continuation. Understanding this is essential to understanding why diplomatic initiatives have consistently failed to produce a settlement. For South Korea, the situation is structurally different. South Korea has grown into one of the world's largest economies. Under the security umbrella of the U.S. alliance, it has a democratic political system, a sophisticated military, and a population that is simultaneously aware of the threat and acclimated to living with it. The South Korean public has largely normalized the situation, not because the threat is not real, but because a population cannot maintain indefinite maximum alert and still function as a society. This normalization is itself a strategic phenomenon. The United States has maintained its alliance commitment for 7 decades because the Korean Peninsula is strategically significant. Beyond the Korean issue itself, a North Korean collapse or Korean unification under either government would have profound implications for China, Japan, and the regional balance of power. The U.S. forward presence in Korea is not only about Korea. It is about the broader architecture of U.S. engagement in Northeast Asia. China's interests are the fourth structural variable. China does not want a North Korean collapse. That would bring U.S. allied forces to its border. It does not want a Korean war that would destabilize the region. And it does not want a North Korea that is so provocative that it forces the United States and its allies into confrontation. China manages this set of contradictory interests through its economic relationship with North Korea and through its diplomatic positions in international bodies. The persistence of the armistice system has costs that are not always fully accounted for. For South Korea, the costs are primarily economic and military. The defense burden, maintaining a large military force, continuously modernizing it, sustaining alliance relationships, is a permanent drag on resources that could otherwise be invested elsewhere. For North Korea, the costs are far more severe. The prioritization of military spending over economic development has produced a country of 25 million people, with an economy a fraction of the size of South Korea's. Periodic food shortages, limited access to international markets, and the economic isolation produced by sanctions are the consequences of a strategic choice that the system has made and continues to make. For the United States, the cost is the permanent maintenance of a forward presence and the political commitment to a security guarantee that the nuclear dimension has made more complex to sustain credibly. The cost of the suspended war is not only military. It is measured in resources, political attention, economic opportunity, and the permanent risk of catastrophic escalation. That cost accrues every year the system continues. The Korean security situation illustrates three analytical principles that extend beyond the peninsula itself. The first, a military ceasefire without a political settlement does not freeze a conflict. It creates a sustained pressure environment that continuously generates risk. The war system does not pause. It runs continuously at a lower level of visible intensity. The absence of active combat is not the same as the presence of stability. The Korean armistice has managed violence. It has not managed the underlying conditions that produce it. The second, nuclear capability, changes the structure of deterrence in ways that cannot be reversed by conventional military planning. The alliance's overwhelming conventional superiority, which is real and documented, does not solve the nuclear problem. It exists alongside it. Two different deterrence calculations running simultaneously, interacting in ways that are genuinely uncertain. Military superiority at the conventional level provides operational options. It does not provide strategic certainty when the opponent has a nuclear option, however costly its use would be. The third, the sustainability of deterrence depends on credibility. And credibility is a function of perception, commitment, capability, and time. Extended deterrence commitments, the U.S. nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan, require continuous reinforcement through deployments, exercises, and diplomatic signaling. They do not self-sustain. Deterrence is not a permanent condition. It is an ongoing achievement. The moment it begins to be taken for granted, it begins to erode. As of the mid-2020s, the Korean security situation has elements that are familiar from the preceding decades, and elements that are genuinely new. The familiar elements: the armistice structure, the forward military deployments, the alliance relationships, the periodic cycles of provocation and response. The genuinely new elements: the maturation of North Korea's nuclear weapons program, the development of intercontinental ballistic missile capability, the deepening of Russia-North Korea military cooperation following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the increasing complexity of the U.S.-China relationship as the context within which Korean peninsula security must be managed. North Korea's relationship with Russia has become operationally significant. The supply of artillery ammunition from North Korea to Russia for use in Ukraine, and the reported transfer of military technology from Russia to North Korea in exchange, represents a shift in the peninsula's strategic context that was not present in any previous decade. The Russia-North Korea relationship creates a specific complication for alliance planning. It suggests that North Korea's isolation, the condition that sanctions were designed to create, has been partially relieved by an alternative patron relationship, and it demonstrates that the Korean security problem cannot be managed without managing its relationship to global power competition. The Korean peninsula does not exist in isolation. It is a node in a larger competition between the United States, China, and Russia. The management of the peninsula requires managing that larger competition simultaneously. Neither can be solved without the other. The Korean war system never fully ended. The armistice that suspended active combat in 1953 created a structure that has been running for 7 decades. That structure determines what is possible, what options are available to each side, what constraints they operate under, and what risks they manage continuously. The structure is not static. It has been continuously updated by North Korea's nuclear development, by South Korea's economic transformation and military modernization, by shifts in the U.S.-China relationship, and now by the Russia-North Korea partnership. But the core architecture remains: a military ceasefire without a political settlement, heavily armed forces facing each other across a narrow zone, a capital city within artillery range of a hostile border, and a nuclear dimension that makes catastrophic escalation a permanent feature of the strategic environment. Understanding this structure is not pessimism. It is the precondition for the policy choices, the military preparations, and the diplomatic efforts that might eventually produce something better. You cannot change a structure you do not understand, and a structure you do not understand will continue to determine outcomes whether you understand it or not. Structure determines what is possible. Subscribe if you think in systems.